Why did Rome succeed where so many others failed? Why did a small city on the banks of the Tiber River rise to dominate the entire Mediterranean world? The answer lies in Rome's greatest weapon, not a single general, not a particular city, but the military machine itself. From its earliest days, Rome's survival depended on war. Surrounded by rival tribes like the Etruscans, Samnites, and Latins, the Romans quickly learned that survival required discipline, adaptation, and organization. Where other societies treated war as the affair of aristocrats or seasonal raiding, Rome transformed it into a systematic institution. At the heart of this machine stood the legion. Unlike the phalanx formations of Greece, the Roman legion was built for flexibility. A Greek phalanx was powerful on flat ground, but brittle on rough terrain. Rome recognized this flaw. Instead of locking men shoulder to shoulder in rigid lines, they broke their forces into smaller tactical units called maniples. Each maniple, made of about 120 men, could move independently, adapting to hills, rivers, or broken terrain. This gave Rome a decisive edge against enemies like the Samnites in Italy's rugged mountains. But the legion wasn't just an idea, it was a way of life. Every Roman soldier was a citizen tied to the Republic's fortunes by oath and by blood. Service wasn't just duty, it was identity. Archaeological finds, from inscribed tombstones to weapon deposits, reveal that soldiers proudly recorded their years of service, victories, and even the maniples they served in. This military pride created cohesion far beyond what mercenary armies could achieve. Yet what truly made Rome's military machine unrivaled was discipline. A legionary wasn't merely a man with a sword, he was trained relentlessly. Roman drill culture was brutal but effective. Soldiers marched 20 miles a day carrying packs that weighed over 40 kilograms. They dug fortifications every night, building marching camps that could house tens of thousands, complete with ditches, ramparts, and watchtowers. Archaeological remains of these marching camps, some still visible in Britain and Germany, show the standardized precision of this nightly ritual. This wasn't wasted energy. It created an army that was always fortified, always prepared, and always bonded through shared labor. As one historian observed, every Roman soldier carried his fortress on his back. The weapons of the Roman legion reflected the same philosophy. The gladius, a short stabbing sword, was designed not for heroic duels, but for coordinated efficiency. In the press of combat, legionaries advanced with locked shields, thrusting in unison lethal. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, was engineered to bend upon impact, preventing enemies from throwing it back. Each piece of equipment reinforced the principle of discipline over individual flair. But Rome's machine wasn't only about soldiers, it was about systems. War required logistics, and Rome excelled here above all. Roads like the Appia Way weren't just trade routes, they were arteries of conquest. Stone-paved, straight, and durable. They allowed legions to march faster than their enemies could anticipate. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," was not a boast, but a strategic truth. These roads allowed troops to redeploy across vast distances, making Rome's power feel omnipresent. Consider the contrast. While Carthaginian armies relied heavily on mercenaries drawn from distant lands, Rome could call up citizen soldiers, bound by loyalty to the state. These soldiers fought not just for pay, but for land, honor, and citizenship rights. This deeper motivation often tipped the balance in Rome's favor, even when facing technically superior foes. Discipline also meant punishment. Rome did not tolerate failure or cowardice. The infamous practice of decimation, executing 1 in every 10 men of a disgraced unit, was rare but terrifying enough to enforce obedience. More commonly, disgrace meant loss of honor, public humiliation, or being forced to camp outside the defenses. The fear of shame bound soldiers as tightly as the promise of reward.
But why did this system endure when others crumbled? The answer lies in Rome's willingness to adapt. After devastating defeats, such as the humiliation at Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, or Hannibal's slaughter of 50,000 Romans at Cannae in 216 BCE, many states might have collapsed. Rome did not. It rebuilt, restructured, and returned stronger. Defeat became a lesson, not an end. One archaeological discovery that highlights this resilience comes from the battlefield of Cannae itself. Mass graves excavated in the Apulia region show the sheer scale of loss. Yet within a generation, Rome not only recovered, but eventually crushed Carthage. Few civilizations in history displayed this relentless willpower. The army also evolved with Rome's political system. Under the Republic, soldiers were primarily landowning citizens, serving for set campaigns before returning home. But as Rome expanded and wars grew longer, the strain on farmers deepened. By the time of Gaius Marius in the late 2nd century BCE, the system shifted. Marius opened recruitment to the landless poor, transforming the army into a professional force. These new soldiers relied on generals for pay and land grants, subtly shifting loyalty from the Senate to charismatic commanders. This change created both strength and danger. Strength because the legions became even more professional, trained for years rather than months. Danger because now the loyalty of tens of thousands depended on individual leaders. The seeds of civil war were planted in this shift, but that is a story for later sections. Still, whether citizen soldiers of the early Republic or professionals of the late Empire, Roman armies remained instruments of precision. Their organizational depth extended beyond the battlefield. They built supply depots, aqueducts, siege engines, and even towns as they marched. Many modern European cities, from Cologne to York, trace their origins directly to Roman military foundations. Strategically, the legion functioned not only as an army, but as a deterrent. The mere presence of a Roman garrison sent a political message: defy Rome, and you face the most efficient war machine of the ancient world. Inscriptions on frontier forts along the Rhine and Danube revealed the pride of stationed units who carved their names into stone, declaring themselves guardians of empire. But consider the deeper lesson. Rome's military was not unbeatable because of size alone. It was unbeatable because of mindset. Discipline, organization, adaptation, and relentless willpower created a system greater than the sum of its parts. Imagine yourself as a tribal chieftain facing Rome. Your warriors fight bravely, perhaps even outnumbering the Romans. But as the battle unfolds, you find their maniples shifting, rotating fresh troops into the line, hurling pila to shatter your charge, and advancing behind a wall of shields. Even if you kill hundreds, more emerge with unshaken discipline. And when night falls, while your men collapse around fires, the Romans calmly dig trenches and raise palisades. By dawn, you face not just an army, but a fortress that moves with them. So what made Rome's military machine unique? Was it the gladius and the pilum, the roads and the camps, the punishments and rewards? Or was it something deeper? The cultural belief that Rome itself was eternal, that no defeat was final, and that every citizen's duty was to defend its honor. This was the foundation on which Rome built its empire. The legion was not just a military unit, it was the embodiment of Rome itself. Flexible, disciplined, relentless, and unyielding. A machine forged not of iron and blood alone, but of identity and purpose. And yet, as powerful as this system was, it would eventually create its own challenges. For when armies become loyal to generals more than the state, and when discipline bends under the weight of ambition, the very machine that built Rome could also tear it apart. But before that unraveling, we must first meet the men who wielded this machine with brilliance and ruthlessness. Generals whose names still echo across history: Scipio, Caesar, and Trajan. They did not just command legions, they shaped destiny. So the question remains, how did these commanders turn the Roman military machine from a tool of defense into an instrument of world conquest. Why did some Roman commanders rise above their peers to become names remembered for 2 millennia? And why did others, despite commanding the same legions, fall into obscurity or defeat? The answer lies not simply in numbers or weapons, but in the minds of men who could see a battlefield like a chessboard, moving legions as if they were extensions of their will. Rome's history is filled with these larger-than-life figures. To understand how Rome conquered and why it sometimes faltered, we must step inside the command tents of its greatest generals. What made Julius Caesar gamble everything on crossing the Rubicon? How did Scipio Africanus, against all odds, break Hannibal's legend? Why did Trajan push the empire beyond the Danube when others warned against overextension? And how did Marcus Aurelius, philosopher and emperor, lead not just with steel, but with stoic endurance? These generals were not merely soldiers. They were tacticians, politicians, psychologists, and, at times, ruthless gamblers whose decisions carried the weight of an empire.
Consider Julius Caesar at the Rubicon in 49 BCE. He commanded only 1 legion, yet with that single force, he defied the Roman Senate and marched on Rome itself. Why risk everything with so little? Caesar understood the power of momentum, both military and psychological. By crossing the Rubicon, he created a moment of no return. His enemies would hesitate, divided by politics and fear, while his soldiers, bound by loyalty and promises of land, would march with absolute conviction. Tactically, Caesar relied on speed. In Gaul, he had perfected the art of rapid marches, using lighter baggage trains and forcing his men to cover distances that stunned his enemies. At Alesia, in 52 BCE, he built a double wall of fortifications around the Gallic stronghold, one to keep Vercingetorix inside, the other to hold back Gallic reinforcements outside. It was engineering as weapon, a tactic that transformed the siege into a death trap. Yet Caesar's brilliance was as much psychological as tactical. He studied his enemies, exploiting their pride. Against Pompey, he bet that Pompey's senators, wealthy aristocrats unused to war, would pressure him into a direct confrontation rather than a war of attrition. Caesar was right. At Pharsalus, Pompey's larger force broke against Caesar's hardened veterans. Caesar had gambled, and once again, the empire tilted in his favor. But Caesar's tactics carried risks. His willingness to gamble with everything created enemies who would, in the Senate, strike him down. His assassination was the counterstroke to his relentless advance. The man who bent Rome's armies to his will could not control the daggers of those who feared his power.
If Caesar was the gambler, then Scipio Africanus was the analyst. Rome had suffered humiliation at Cannae in 216 BCE, where Hannibal's tactical genius destroyed an army twice his size. Rome reeled, many allies defected, and despair set in. Yet out of this chaos rose Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio recognized that Rome could not defeat Hannibal by sheer numbers or frontal assault. Instead, he studied Hannibal's tactics, mobility, deception, and the art of encirclement, and turned them against him. In Spain, Scipio proved his mettle. At the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BCE, he deployed his troops in a formation designed to surprise. Instead of the usual Roman tactic of placing heavy infantry in the center, Scipio reversed the order. He placed his strongest legions on the wings, matching Hannibal's Carthaginian style. When the clash came, his wings overwhelmed Hannibal's weaker center, flipping the Carthaginian strategy back on itself. At Zama in 202 BCE, the ultimate confrontation arrived. Hannibal, master of elephants, lined them up for a crushing charge. Scipio had prepared. Instead of locking shields tightly, he ordered lanes left open.
The elephants, expecting to crash into a wall, found only channels that guided them harmlessly past the Roman lines. With their terror weapon neutralized, Hannibal's army faced disciplined infantry and a decisive Roman cavalry strike. Scipio's brilliance was not only tactical but strategic. He shifted the war from Italy to Africa, forcing Hannibal to defend his homeland. By changing the theater of war, he dictated terms. His victory earned him the name Africanus and restored Rome's shaken pride.
Fast forward to the height of the empire under Trajan in the early 2nd century CE. Rome was already vast, but Trajan sought more. His campaigns in Dacia, north of the Danube, were as much about prestige and resources as about security. Why risk expansion beyond the Danube, where terrain favored the defenders and supply lines stretched thin? Trajan recognized the value of Dacia's gold mines. With Rome's economy increasingly strained, conquest offered wealth to fund the empire. Trajan was a general of preparation. He built massive bridges across the Danube, engineering marvels that allowed entire legions to cross swiftly. Unlike Caesar's gambler's instinct or Scipio's counter-tactics, Trajan relied on overwhelming force and methodical planning. The Dacian Wars climaxed at the siege of Sarmizegetissa, the Dacian capital. Roman engineers dismantled the city's water supply, undermining resistance without prolonged bloodshed. When victory came, Trajan paraded Dacia's treasures through Rome and erected his Great Column, its spiraling reliefs still teaching us his methods of war. Yet Trajan's ambition also revealed Rome's limits. His later campaigns in Parthia stretched Rome's resources too far, and after his death, much of the territory was abandoned. His victories showed Rome at its most powerful, but also hinted at the dangers of overreach. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, at war. Unlike Trajan, Marcus Aurelius never sought conquest. His reign in the 2nd century CE was consumed not by dreams of expansion, but by survival. On the northern frontier, Germanic tribes pressed hard, testing Rome's defenses. Marcus faced a dilemma. As emperor, his duty was both philosophical and military. His meditations reveal a man torn between stoic reflection and the brutal demands of war. Yet he proved resilient. On campaign, he shared the hardships of his soldiers, eating their rations, enduring the cold, and earning their loyalty. Strategically, Marcus adapted to the changing nature of warfare. The old legions, built for open battle, now faced mobile tribal warbands. He emphasized fortified camps, supply lines, and relentless pressure to grind down the enemy. The wars were less about decisive battles and more about endurance, an emperor's philosophy applied to strategy. Archaeological evidence, like inscriptions from legionary camps on the Danube frontier, shows how Marcus rebuilt defenses systematically. His reign kept Rome intact, though at enormous cost. The empire endured, but the cracks of constant frontier pressure were becoming harder to hide. The legacy of Roman generals. From Caesar's daring gambles to Scipio's counter-tactics, from Trajan's overwhelming force to Marcus Aurelius' stoic resilience, Rome's generals shaped not only the empire's borders, but its identity. Each embodied a different answer to the eternal question of command: when to strike, when to endure, when to gamble, and when to prepare.
Why did Rome, the mightiest empire on earth, so often turn its sword against itself? And why did the political struggles of the elite often prove more decisive than any foreign enemy? To understand Rome's military history, we must also examine its political battleground. Because power in Rome was never simply about commanding armies, it was about mastering intrigue, alliances, betrayals, and ambition. From its earliest days as a republic, Rome's system of checks and balances was designed to prevent one man from seizing total control. Two consuls, elected annually, shared power. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats, acted as both counsel and watchdog. But this very system contained the seeds of constant conflict. Ambitious generals, flush with victory and supported by loyal legions, could leverage military success into political dominance. And in turn, the Senate often tried to curb them, leading to bitter rivalries that shaped the destiny of Rome.
Consider the career of Gaius Marius, the general who reformed Rome's armies at the end of the 2nd century BCE. Marius opened enlistment to the landless poor, creating legions whose loyalty shifted away from the Republic and toward their commander. Militarily, it was a masterstroke. Politically, it was a revolution. No longer was the Roman army tied to the state, it was bound by personal loyalty. And Marius exploited this bond to repeatedly seize the consulship, holding it 7 times in total. He used his soldiers not just to defend Rome, but to dominate its politics. But where Marius innovated, his rival Sulla perfected the darker side of Roman political warfare. When the Senate denied him command of a lucrative campaign, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions into Rome itself. For the first time in history, Roman soldiers slaughtered Roman citizens in the heart of the city. Sulla's ruthless dictatorship, marked by proscription lists, public death warrants for his political enemies, set a chilling precedent. From this moment on, every ambitious general knew that Rome's real prize was not victory abroad, but power at home.
This cycle of political rivalry and civil strife escalated in the late Republic. Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar formed the so-called First Triumvirate, an alliance of convenience designed to bypass the Senate. Each brought something to the table. Pompey, his military glory, Crassus, his vast wealth, and Caesar, his rising popularity and daring ambition. Together, they bent Rome's political system to their will. But Rome's structures were never designed to contain such power concentrated in so few hands. The cracks soon showed. Crassus, eager to win glory equal to his peers, led a disastrous campaign against the Parthians and was killed at Carrhae. Pompey, increasingly threatened by Caesar's growing influence, turned to the Senate for support. Caesar, ordered to disband his army and return to Rome, faced a choice: accept humiliation or defy the Republic. His decision at the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, the die is cast, plunged Rome into civil war.
Why did Caesar march on Rome instead of obeying the Senate? Tactically, it was the only option. Without his legions, he faced prosecution and political ruin. Strategically, it demonstrated how Rome's military machine had become a tool of personal ambition. Caesar's gamble paid off. He defeated Pompey, seized power, and was eventually declared dictator for life. Yet even Caesar's brilliance could not save him from the knives of those who feared that one-man rule meant the death of the Republic. His assassination in 44 BCE was a political murder, staged not on the battlefield, but in the Senate chamber itself. But killing Caesar did not restore the old order. Instead, it unleashed a new and bloodier round of civil wars. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, joined forces with Mark Antony and Lepidus in the Second Triumvirate. They too used proscription lists to eliminate rivals and seize property, binding their soldiers to them with both fear and reward. Eventually, Octavian turned on Antony, their rivalry culminating in the decisive Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's victory did more than eliminate his rival. It transformed Rome. The Republic was finished. The Principate, Rome's imperial system, was born. Octavian, now Augustus, was a master of political theater. Unlike Caesar, he understood the dangers of appearing too overtly dictatorial. He cloaked his authority in the language of tradition, insisting that he was merely first among equals. Yet beneath this facade, Augustus built an empire in which ultimate power rested firmly with him. His genius lay not just in commanding armies, but in manipulating symbols, traditions, and appearances to secure his dominance.
Political intrigue did not vanish with the Republic, it merely shifted into the imperial palace. Emperors faced constant threats from senators, rival generals, and even their own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers entrusted with protecting them. This guard, meant as the emperor's shield, often became his greatest danger. They assassinated emperors, installed new ones, and auctioned the throne to the highest bidder. Consider the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE, when Rome saw 4 rulers rise and fall in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. Each relied on military support to seize power, and each revealed the fragility of imperial authority when personal ambition outweighed loyalty to the state. The empire survived, but its stability always balanced on a knife's edge. The same pattern re-emerged centuries later, during the crisis of the 3rd century. In just 50 years, more than 20 emperors rose and fell, many assassinated by their own troops. Roman politics had become inseparable from military intrigue. Generals proclaimed themselves emperors, armies switched allegiances, and the empire nearly tore itself apart from within. But political intrigue was not only about military ambition. It also played out through dynastic marriages, calculated assassinations, and court conspiracies. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was whispered to have arranged the deaths of rivals to secure her son Tiberius's succession. Later, empresses, senators, and palace officials all took part in the dangerous game of Roman politics, where one wrong move could mean exile, execution, or worse. What made Rome unique was not simply its military might, but how deeply that might was entangled with politics. Unlike modern states where professional armies are clearly subordinate to civilian governments, in Rome the lines blurred. Soldiers swore loyalty to their commanders, and commanders wielded that loyalty as a political weapon. Victory on the battlefield translated into power in the Senate, and control of the Senate opened doors to more campaigns. It was a self-perpetuating cycle that rewarded ambition but eroded stability. The strategic consequences of this political-military entanglement were profound. Foreign enemies often exploited Rome's internal divisions. Mithridates of Pontus, for instance, launched his wars against Rome at moments when Roman generals were distracted by rivalries at home. Later, barbarian groups pressed their advantage during Rome's civil conflicts. Again and again, Rome's greatest danger came not from its borders, but from its own leaders.
Consider what you would have done if you were a Roman senator watching these events unfold. Do you back the general with the strongest army, hoping he'll reward your loyalty? Or do you cling to the fading ideal of the Republic, risking exile or death? These were not abstract debates. They were questions of survival. And in Rome, survival often depended less on principle than on choosing the right faction at the right time. In the end, political intrigue and power plays shaped the empire just as much as military campaigns. The Republic collapsed not because of foreign invasion, but because its system could not contain the ambitions of men like Marius, Sulla, Caesar, and Octavian. The empire endured for centuries, but even emperors could never escape the shadow of intrigue. Power in Rome was always precarious, always contested, and always tied to the sword. This reality carried both strength and weakness. It allowed Rome to adapt, to shift power structures, and to survive crises that might have destroyed lesser states. But it also left Rome vulnerable to endless cycles of civil war and assassination. The empire's greatest generals were often its greatest threats, and its political leaders could seldom resist the temptation to wield military power for personal gain. Thus, Rome's story is not simply of conquest abroad, but of conquest at home. Ambition triumphing over tradition, personal loyalty replacing civic duty, and power plays deciding the fate of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen.
Why did Rome, at the height of its power, sometimes stumble against foes it considered inferior? Why did the world's most disciplined legions find themselves ambushed, annihilated, or forced into humiliating retreats? The answer lies in a truth that Rome often forgot. No empire, however mighty, can dominate without challenge. Rome's enemies were not passive victims waiting for conquest. They adapted, learned, and struck back with terrifying force. And sometimes, Rome's arrogance opened the door to disaster.
No enemy embodies this more vividly than Hannibal Barca of Carthage. After Rome's victory in the First Punic War, many senators assumed their North African rival had been broken for good. But Hannibal was raised with one mission: revenge. When he marched his army across the Alps in 218 BCE, Rome was stunned. Snow, avalanches, hostile tribes, most generals would have turned back. Hannibal pressed on, bringing war elephants to terrify Roman troops unused to such beasts. By the time he descended into Italy, Hannibal had forged a hardened, loyal army ready to bleed Rome on its own soil. At the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal unleashed one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in history. Facing a Roman army nearly twice his size, he feigned weakness at the center while strengthening his flanks. As the Romans pressed forward, the Carthaginian wings encircled them in a deadly double envelopment. Nearly 50,000 Romans were cut down in a single day. Consider this: Rome had never seen so many of its citizens slaughtered in one battle. Senators panicked, alliances wavered, and the very survival of the Republic was in question. Why didn't Hannibal march on Rome immediately? Strategically, his army was too exhausted to besiege the city, and he hoped Rome's allies would defect en masse. But Rome's genius was its resilience. Instead of surrender, it doubled down. Fabius Maximus introduced his famous Fabian strategy, avoiding direct battles and starving Hannibal's army of supplies. In time, Rome would turn the tide, but Hannibal had proved that even the strongest empire could bleed.
Long before Hannibal, another enemy exposed Rome's vulnerability. In 390 BCE, at the Battle of the Allia River, the Roman army faced the Gauls under Brennus. The legions broke in panic, fleeing the field, and the Gauls marched into Rome itself. The image of Brennus casting his sword onto the scales during ransom negotiations, uttering the infamous words, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished, seared itself into Roman memory. Rome's pride had been shattered, its temples burned, its streets pillaged. From that humiliation arose a Roman obsession. Never again would the city be so vulnerable. The sack of Rome by the Gauls hardened Roman military policy for centuries. Every defeat was treated not as an end, but as a lesson. The Allia became a ghost haunting Roman strategy, driving expansion outward so that enemies could never again threaten the city's heart.
Centuries later, in 53 BCE, another humiliation awaited Rome, this time in the deserts of the east. Marcus Lysias Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men and part of the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, sought military glory to match his political power. His chosen target, Parthia, the Eastern Empire that commanded the Silk Road's wealth. At Carrhae, the Parthians showed that Rome's legions were not invincible. Using mounted archers and heavily armored cataphracts, the Parthians refused to fight Rome in a traditional pitched battle. Instead, they showered the legions with relentless arrow fire. Roman shields could not protect them from all directions, and their rigid formations became death traps in the open desert. When the Romans attempted to charge, the Parthian horsemen withdrew, only to return with fresh arrows. It was a tactical nightmare. Crassus himself was killed and his army destroyed. According to some accounts, molten gold was poured down his throat in mockery of his greed. Strategically, Carrhae was devastating. It signaled to the world that Rome could be beaten by an enemy willing to fight asymmetrically,
refusing to meet the legions on Rome's terms. The Parthians had found the empire's weak spot, mobility versus rigidity, and exploited it mercilessly. But perhaps no blow shocked Rome more than the disaster in Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE. By then, Rome had expanded deep into Germania, believing its legions could tame the wild tribes of the north. Publius Quintilius Varus, governor of the region, grew complacent, treating the tribes as already subdued. Unknown to him, a Germanic chieftain named Arminius, trained in Roman tactics as an auxiliary officer, was secretly uniting the tribes against their occupiers. He fed Varus false intelligence, luring him into a dense forest during a storm. There, in the twisting terrain of mud, rain, and thick trees, 3 Roman legions found themselves ambushed. Their formations useless, their cavalry bogged down, their supply trains torn apart. What followed was a massacre. Between 15,000 and 20,000 soldiers were slaughtered. The eagle standards of the legions were captured, an unthinkable disgrace. When Emperor Augustus heard of the disaster, he reportedly tore his clothes and cried out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Rome never fully recovered its ambitions in Germania. The Rhine River became the boundary of the empire's northern frontier, shaped forever by that catastrophe.
Even after Parthia, Rome's struggles in the east continued. By the 3rd century, the Sassanid Persians emerged as a formidable foe. Unlike the Parthians, they were not content with defense. Under Shapur I, they struck deep into Roman territory, even capturing the Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation unparalleled in Roman history. Captured alive, Valerian was allegedly used as a human footstool by the Persian king before being executed. Whether or not the story is exaggerated, the psychological impact was undeniable. For the first time, the image of Roman emperors as untouchable masters of
Rome's enemies also struck back through rebellion within its provinces. In Judea, resentment of Roman taxation and religious interference exploded into the First Jewish Revolt. In 66 to 73 CE, the revolt forced Rome into brutal urban warfare, culminating in the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Led by General Titus, Roman forces encircled the city, cutting off supplies. Famine ravaged the population, but the Jewish defenders fought with unyielding spirit. When the city finally fell, the Second Temple was destroyed, a loss so profound it reshaped Jewish identity forever. But resistance continued. At Masada, Jewish rebels held out in a mountaintop fortress. Rather than surrender when the Romans breached the walls, they chose mass suicide. To this day, Masada stands as a symbol of defiance against overwhelming power. For Rome, the revolts were a reminder that conquest bred rebellion, and that suppression came at enormous cost. Strategic victory in Judea was offset by moral and financial strain, fueling discontent across the empire.
Why did Rome, despite its brilliance, suffer such crushing defeats? The answer lies in strategy. Rome's strength was discipline, engineering, and organization. But its weakness was predictability. Enemies who fought on Rome's terms were usually crushed. Those who exploited terrain, mobility, or deception often succeeded. Hannibal at Cannae, Arminius in Teutoburg Forest, the Parthians at Carrhae, all revealed that Rome could not adapt quickly enough to unconventional warfare. Yet Rome's genius was not in never losing, but in refusing to stay defeated. Each disaster forced new reforms, strengthening cavalry, reinforcing frontiers, adapting supply lines. Still, the scars of these defeats ran deep. They shaped Roman psychology, strategy, and even propaganda. For every triumphal arch proclaiming victory, there was the memory of legions lost in forests, deserts, or mountain passes.
Rome's enemies had struck back with fury, proving that the empire was not invincible. Yet as dangerous as these external foes were, the deadliest enemy was not Carthage, Parthia, or Germania. It was Rome itself. Political corruption, ambition, and civil war would do what foreign armies never could: unravel the empire from within. But how did a state that survived Hannibal, Arminius, and Shapur fall prey to its own leaders? And why did internal betrayal prove more destructive than any barbarian sword? The answer lies in Rome's internal decay in civil wars, the subject of our next chapter.
In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion. It was not a massive army, but it was enough. The act itself was a declaration of war against the Senate. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. Once again, Roman legions were set against Roman legions. The civil war that followed saw Caesar's tactical genius unleashed not against foreign foes, but against his fellow citizens. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, he crushed Pompey's larger army through discipline, speed, and ruthless precision. Rome itself became the prize, and Caesar claimed it. But absolute power is fragile. Caesar's dictatorship alarmed senators who feared monarchy's return. In 44 BCE, daggers struck him down in the Senate House. The conspirators imagined they had saved the Republic, but they had only plunged Rome deeper into chaos. Instead of restoring freedom, Caesar's death triggered another round of civil wars. Wars that would end not in Republican revival, but in empire. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, proved a master strategist not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of politics. He framed himself as the defender of Caesar's legacy while quietly eliminating rivals. His final confrontation with Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE was more than a battle. It was the moment Rome chose empire over republic. Octavian's victory cemented his transformation into Augustus, the first emperor. Rome's system of shared power between Senate and people had been replaced by the rule of one. Yet this new imperial system carried its own fatal flaws. Power was no longer contested through debate, but through intrigue, assassination, and palace coups. Emperors rose and fell as Praetorian guards betrayed, senators schemed, and generals maneuvered. Consider Emperor Commodus, more obsessed with gladiatorial games than governing an empire. His assassination in 192 CE unleashed a wave of civil wars known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Armies auctioned the throne to the highest bidder, proving that Rome's loyalty had shifted entirely, from ideals of the Republic to the purses of ambitious generals. The consequences of constant civil wars were catastrophic. Economically, Rome was drained. Gold meant for public works or frontier defenses now vanished into bribes and military payoffs. Strategically, legions were pulled from borders to fight in civil wars, leaving provinces vulnerable to external attack. Enemies like the Parthians, Goths, and Vandals seized the opportunity to raid undefended frontiers. Militarily, discipline eroded. Soldiers learned they could make or break emperors. Loyalty shifted with promises of land and wealth rather than duty to Rome. Archaeological evidence paints a stark picture. Coins from the 3rd century show emperors who reigned for mere months before being overthrown. Mass graves from Civil War battlefields reveal Roman soldiers slaughtered by Roman swords. Inscriptions in frontier forts suddenly end, silent proof of garrisons abandoned during the chaos of internal strife. The empire was rotting from the inside out. But perhaps the most devastating effect was psychological. The Roman people, once united by pride in conquest and civic duty, grew disillusioned. Trust in government vanished. Allegiances fractured along regional lines. Gaulish legions loyal to their general, eastern provinces looking toward their own survival. The very idea of Rome as one unified force began to fade. Consider what you would have done as emperor in this climate. How do you maintain loyalty when soldiers see themselves as kingmakers? How do you secure frontiers when your best generals eye the throne? The empire's survival depended not just on armies, but on controlling ambition, a battle no emperor could fully win. By the time Diocletian rose in the 3rd century, Rome was desperate for stability. His reforms, splitting the empire into East and West, creating the Tetrarchy, were attempts to manage the unmanageable. Yet even these measures only delayed the inevitable. The cycle of
Why did Rome, an empire feared across continents, begin to crumble from within? The answer lies not in the strength of its enemies, but in the fractures of its own foundations. Civil wars, corruption, and personal ambition became weapons more destructive than any barbarian sword. To understand Rome's downfall, we must first see how victory itself bred decay. At the height of its power, Rome had stretched its military machine to the limits. Endless conquest filled the treasury with gold, but it also created something far more dangerous. Generals whose loyalty was no longer to the Republic, but to themselves. Consider the question: what happens when armies fight not for Rome, but for one man's ambition? This was the fatal flaw that transformed Rome's military brilliance into a civil war machine. Take Gaius Marius, for instance. His reforms had saved Rome during the dark days of invasion. He professionalized the army, giving landless citizens a place in the legions. Yet these soldiers no longer depended on the Senate for rewards. They depended on their general. Marius unknowingly planted the seeds of personal armies, loyal only to their commander's promises. It was a tactical innovation that secured victories in the short term, but strategically, it opened the gates to political chaos. Marius's rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla provides one of the first examples of generals turning their legions against Rome itself. In 88 BCE, when Sulla was stripped of command in the war against Mithridates, he did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome. No foreign power had ever dared such an act, but here was a Roman general storming his own capital with Roman soldiers. The streets of Rome became a battlefield, setting a precedent that would haunt the empire for centuries. The Republic had crossed a threshold. Political disputes would no longer be settled in the Senate chamber, but with swords and legions. The collapse of trust between Senate, people, and army accelerated. As civil wars raged, Rome's enemies rejoiced. But inside the city, another transformation was underway. The rise of political opportunists who mastered the art of manipulating military power. Julius Caesar is the most famous example. Brilliant, charismatic, and ruthless. Caesar understood that true power lay in the undying loyalty of soldiers who had marched with him, bled with him, and enriched themselves under his command. His conquest of Gaul was as much a personal empire as it was Roman territory. When the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he faced the ultimate tactical question: surrender his command or seize absolute power. His decision would shape the fate of Rome.
Civil wars had permanently weakened the empire, draining its strength long before the barbarians delivered the final blow. Thus, Rome's greatest enemy was not Hannibal, nor the Persians, nor the Goths. It was itself. The discipline and unity that had built an empire gave way to ambition and betrayal. Victory abroad had made Rome rich, but civil war at home made it fragile. And fragility, in the end, is what enemies exploit.
Why did the most disciplined army in history crumble beneath the charge of tribes once dismissed as barbarians? This question has haunted historians for centuries because Rome's fall wasn't the work of one battle, nor the fault of one enemy. It was a slow unraveling of power, punctuated by devastating blows from determined foes who learned, adapted, and exploited every weakness. To understand the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, we must trace the chain of invasions, betrayals, and desperate defenses that marked Rome's twilight years. The story begins on the empire's vast northern frontier. For centuries, Rome had held back the tide of Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube rivers. But by the late 4th century, new pressures were building. The Huns, fierce horse archers sweeping out of the Eurasian steppe, crashed into the Gothic tribes, driving them like a hammer into Rome's borders. Suddenly, the empire faced not scattered raiding parties, but entire nations, men, women, and children, seeking refuge, food, and land. In 376 CE, tens of thousands of Goths begged to cross the Danube into Roman territory, promising loyalty in exchange for safety. The Romans agreed, but mismanaged the crisis catastrophically. Officials extorted the starving Goths, even selling them dog meat at outrageous prices. Resentment boiled over. In 378 CE, the Goths rose in open rebellion, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, eager for glory, rashly engaged them without waiting for reinforcements. What followed was one of the most disastrous defeats in Roman history. The disciplined legions were swarmed and annihilated by Gothic cavalry. Valens himself perished on the field, his body never recovered. For the first time in centuries, a Roman emperor had fallen to foreign arms in open battle. This defeat was more than a tactical blunder. It shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. The empire now had to negotiate with Gothic warlords as equals, granting them lands inside its borders as federates. Rome was no longer dictating terms, it was bargaining for survival. Consider the irony. The very tribes once crushed beneath the legions were now settled within the empire, armed and semi-independent. But Rome's troubles were only beginning. In the early 4th century, another Gothic leader would rise, Alaric. A former Roman ally, Alaric knew the empire's weaknesses intimately. Denied the promotions and recognition he sought, he turned against Rome itself. In 410 CE, his Gothic army marched into the heart of Italy. The Eternal City, unthinkably, was besieged. For 3 days, Alaric's Goths looted Rome. Though the destruction was limited compared to later sackings, the psychological blow was immense. The city that had ruled the known world for 1,000 years now lay at the mercy of men it once called barbarians. Saint Jerome, writing in Bethlehem, captured the despair. The city that had taken the whole world was itself taken. How did the empire respond? Instead of unity, it fractured further. Rival generals carved out personal power bases. Provinces withheld taxes or raised their own militias. The Western emperors, often puppets installed by ambitious warlords, lacked the authority to restore order. Meanwhile, new waves of invaders surged across the borders: Vandals, Suebi, Burgundians, and Franks. Each exploited Rome's weakened defenses, carving out kingdoms in Spain, Gaul, and North Africa. Rome's legions, stretched thin and underpaid, could not hold them back. Perhaps the most devastating loss came in 439 CE when the Vandals captured Carthage. This wasn't just another city. It was Rome's breadbasket, the vital source of grain and revenue that kept the Western Empire afloat. With Carthage gone, the empire's economy withered. Even worse, the Vandals became a naval power, launching raids across the Mediterranean. Rome, once the mistress of the seas, now cowered from pirate fleets.
Desperation drove the empire into uneasy alliances. The most famous came in 451 CE when Attila the Hun swept into Gaul. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila led a coalition of Huns, Ostrogoths, and other tribes, threatening to obliterate what remained of Roman authority. In one of history's last great Roman victories, General Flavius Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, forged an unlikely alliance with the Visigoths.
At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, Roman discipline and Gothic ferocity combined to halt Attila's advance. Though the Huns would ravage Italy the following year, Attila's mystique was broken, and he soon died mysteriously, leaving his empire to collapse in chaos. Yet even Aetius could not save Rome from itself. Betrayed by court intrigues, he was murdered by Emperor Valentinian III, an Act 1 chronicler compared to cutting off one's right hand. Without Aetius, the Western Empire had no commander capable of holding the line. When the Vandals sailed into Rome in 455 CE, there was no resistance. For 2 weeks, they plundered the Eternal City, carrying off treasures, captives, and even the Empress herself. The term vandalism still echoes their legacy of destruction. By now, the Western Empire was little more than a shell. Its armies relied increasingly on barbarian mercenaries, many of whom owed no real loyalty to Rome. Generals like Ricimer and Odoacer held the true power, while emperors became disposable figureheads. In 476 CE, the final blow fell. Odoacer, a Germanic commander in Roman service, deposed the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus. Rather than claim the imperial title himself, Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. To many contemporaries, it seemed a formality. The Western Empire had been dead in practice long before. But symbolically, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus marked the end of Rome's 1,000-year dominion in the West. Why did Rome fall? Some point to economic decay, others to military overstretch or the corrosive effects of political corruption. But perhaps the deeper truth is that Rome faced enemies who learned and adapted. The so-called barbarians weren't mindless hordes. They were pragmatic, fierce, and increasingly Romanized themselves. They studied Rome's strengths, exploited its weaknesses, and ultimately replaced it with kingdoms of their own. Ironically, many of these kingdoms would preserve Roman laws, languages, and traditions, ensuring that Rome never truly died, but was reborn in new forms. Consider what you would have done, standing in the sandals of a late Roman general. Your treasury is empty, your soldiers unpaid, your borders collapsing. Do you hire more barbarian mercenaries, knowing they may betray you? Do you abandon distant provinces to save the heartland? Or do you gamble on bold campaigns to reclaim lost lands? Each choice carried enormous risk, and for the Western Roman Empire, none proved enough.
In the end, Rome didn't fall in a single battle, but through 1,000 cuts, defeats, betrayals, sackings, and losses. Yet the fall of the West was not the end of Rome itself. In the East, Constantinople endured for another 1,000 years, carrying the legacy of Roman statecraft and military power deep into the medieval world. But in the West, the torch passed to the so-called barbarians, peoples who had once trembled before the legions and now forged their own destinies upon Rome's ruins.
What lessons does the story of Rome hold for us today? How could a civilization so vast, so disciplined, and so brilliant in strategy, administration, and culture crumble beneath its own weight and the pressure of determined enemies? The fall of Rome is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale, a mirror reflecting the strengths and vulnerabilities of all human societies. Rome's story begins with its military genius, the disciplined legions that conquered the known world. Yet, as we've seen, military power alone cannot guarantee survival. Rome's enemies, from Hannibal to the Goths, exploited weakness, adapted to Roman tactics, and forced the empire into crisis. But the greatest threats were internal. Ambition, corruption, and civil war slowly eroded the pillars of authority. The empire's decline illustrates a simple truth. Institutions, no matter how formidable, must maintain legitimacy, loyalty, and resilience, or they will be undone from within. Consider modern parallels. In contemporary military and political strategy, we see echoes of Rome everywhere.
Nations that rely solely on military might, ignoring social cohesion, economic stability, or the loyalty of their people, risk strategic collapse. Rome's professionalization of armies, once its greatest innovation, became a double-edged sword when soldiers' allegiance shifted from state to general. Today, the principle remains relevant. Personal loyalty cannot substitute for institutional integrity. Leadership, whether in a nation or organization, must balance charisma with systemic resilience.
Economically, Rome teaches the dangers of overextension and dependency. The Western Empire's reliance on frontier provinces for revenue and grain made it vulnerable to external shocks. When Vandals captured Carthage, Rome's food supply and economy were devastated. Modern economies, globalized and interdependent, face similar vulnerabilities. Critical supply chains, over-leveraged debts, or over-reliance on singular resources can destabilize entire systems, mirroring Rome's experience in the 5th century. But beyond strategy and economics, Rome's decline offers insights into human nature. The Republic, and later the Empire, depended on civic virtue, shared purpose, and collective responsibility. Once citizens and soldiers began to act primarily in self-interest, the fabric of society frayed. Civil wars erupted, trust eroded, and the empire's leaders became more concerned with personal power than public good. The lesson is timeless. Institutions, no matter how vast, require ethical foundations and mutual accountability. Without them, even the mightiest empires are fragile. Culturally, Rome's legacy endured long after its political collapse. Latin language, Roman law, architectural principles, and engineering techniques formed the bedrock of European civilization. The fall of the Western Empire did not erase Rome, it transformed it. New kingdoms adopted Roman systems, blending Roman organization with local traditions. In this sense, Rome's story is not one of total defeat, but of transformation. Collapse and renewal often coexist. Even when political power wanes, ideas, knowledge, and cultural frameworks persist. From a military perspective, Rome demonstrates the interplay between innovation and adaptability. Hannibal's campaigns, the Parthian cavalry, Gothic guerrilla tactics, and Hunnic mobility all challenged Rome's rigid formations. The empire's slow response highlights a universal principle. Adaptability is as crucial as strength. Modern military strategists, business leaders, and policymakers study Rome not just for its victories, but for its failures to adapt quickly to emerging threats. In an era of rapid technological and social change, the Romans' mistakes remain strikingly relevant.
Archaeological evidence reinforces these lessons. Excavations of frontier forts, battlefields, and urban ruins reveal the human cost of Rome's decline. Thousands of soldiers buried in hastily dug graves, city walls breached, inscriptions abruptly ending as towns were abandoned. Material culture shows both the sophistication of Roman engineering and the fragility of overextended systems. These tangible records remind us that history is not abstract. It is a story of human choices, consequences, and the persistent struggle to balance ambition with prudence. Moreover, Rome's political intrigues, betrayals, and civil wars offer a cautionary tale about leadership and governance. Power vacuums, succession crises, and personal ambition undermine state stability. Julius Caesar's rise, Augustus' consolidation, and the endless coups of later emperors illustrate how central authority can collapse when leaders prioritize personal gain over institutional health. Modern parallels are clear. Nations, corporations, and organizations must establish clear succession, transparent processes, and checks on individual power to survive turbulent times. Even the Western Empire's collapse did not prevent the survival of the Eastern Empire, known as Byzantium, for another 1,000 years. Constantinople preserved Roman law, military organization, and culture, showing that decline is often partial, not total. Lessons from Rome include the value of decentralized resilience, the
the importance of strong institutions, and the dangers of concentrating power without accountability. In other words, Rome fell in the West because the empire's structures could not withstand internal pressures, even while the East endured. Civically, Rome teaches us that engagement matters. When the Senate, citizens, and provincial elites withdrew their support or acted only in self-interest, the state weakened irreparably. Engagement, loyalty, and active participation in governance are crucial for stability. Modern societies, facing polarization, bureaucratic inertia, or eroding trust in institutions, can draw stark parallels. Rome's decline is a warning that neglecting civic cohesion can have cascading effects, even for seemingly invincible powers.
Perhaps most compellingly, Rome reminds us of the interplay between human ambition and structural fragility. Leaders like Caesar, Sulla, and later Augustus illustrate how individuals can both save and imperil civilizations. Strategic brilliance, when combined with unchecked ambition, can accelerate decay as much as it can secure triumph. Modern leaders, CEOs, or generals must navigate this delicate balance, recognizing that short-term gains may compromise long-term stability. Finally, the psychological dimension of Rome's fall resonates across time. The terror inspired by Hannibal, the shock of Teutoburg Forest, the horror of sackings, and the betrayal of civil war created fear, uncertainty, and demoralization, conditions that magnify even minor weaknesses. Today we see similar dynamics in modern geopolitics. Perception, morale, and trust often influence outcomes as much as raw military or economic power. Rome's history teaches that maintaining legitimacy, morale, and credibility is essential for enduring strength. In conclusion, Rome's rise and fall is more than a historical narrative. It is a repository of lessons for modern society. Militarily, economically, politically, and culturally, the empire demonstrates both the heights human civilization can achieve and the vulnerabilities inherent in complex systems. Its legions, generals, engineers, senators, and citizens all contributed to a civilization capable of extraordinary feats, and yet susceptible to collapse when discipline, loyalty, and foresight were compromised.
Rome's enemies, foreign and internal, struck with precision, exploiting weaknesses and forcing adaptation. Modern leaders can study these campaigns to understand strategy, risk, and resilience. Rome's cultural legacy reminds us that even in decline, knowledge, law, and engineering endure. Its civil wars warn us of the dangers of ambition unchecked by institutions, and its ultimate fall underscores a universal truth. No power lasts forever without adaptation, cohesion, and vigilance. The story of Rome is, therefore, not merely about an empire lost. It is about the enduring lessons of human society. It is about the fragility of greatness, the consequences of internal decay, and the necessity of constant strategic foresight. It challenges us to ask, what structures today are overextended, overconfident, or vulnerable to internal decay? How can we learn from the past to build systems, military, political, economic, or social, that endure? Rome's history is a mirror. It reflects ambition, triumph, failure, and resilience. And above all, it asks us to consider, if we are the heirs to this legacy, will we heed the lessons of legions, emperors, and citizens? Or will we, like Rome's Western Empire, allow greatness to fall overnight?